You're about to watch a story about a man who spent 12 years hunting the woman he believed destroyed him, only to discover she had been quietly saving everything he loved while he sharpened his hatred into a blade. This is not a love story. It's a reckoning. Stay until the end. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Part 1. The rain had been falling since noon, which Dante Moretti took as a personal insult. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the 43rd floor, a glass of 18-year scotch hanging from two fingers he hadn't bothered to warm, watching Manhattan drown in gray water and yellow headlights. The Velasco deal was done. 3 years of careful positioning, 17 shell companies, 2 federal moles quietly paid for their discretion, and tonight a Colombian shipping empire had formally passed into Moretti hands. His consigliere had uncorked a bottle of 1998 Barolo downstairs, where the rest of them were celebrating. Dante had come up here instead. He was 41 years old. He had more money than he could spend in 4 lifetimes and more enemies than he could kill in 1. Both numbers kept climbing. He'd stopped being surprised by either. What surprised him, what still had the audacity to catch him off guard after all this time, was that on the night of the biggest acquisition in Moretti history, standing at the top of a building that bore his family's name on a private plaque no one but the right people were ever meant to see, his mind went back to a girl in a green raincoat standing under a bus shelter on West 34th, laughing at something he'd said that wasn't even that funny. He finished the scotch, set the glass down too hard. The sound was the only thing in the room. 12 years was long enough. He knew that. Somewhere under the scar tissue and the accumulated weight of every decision he'd made since then, he knew that. And yet here he was, 41 years old, the most feared name in organized crime east of the Mississippi, and a memory of a girl laughing in the rain could still find the exact right pressure point and press. He turned away from the window. He had a dynasty to run. The Whitmore Gala happened every October at the Metropolitan Pavilion. It raised money for causes that wealthy people felt good about supporting publicly, and it gave the city's legitimate power brokers a reason to dress up and remind each other of their own importance. Dante attended because 3 of his legitimate holding companies had board seats that required it, because his public-facing attorneys strongly advised visibility, and because his head of security, Marco D'Annunzio, had spent 2 weeks convincing him that complete absence from civic life was a liability. He hadn't expected anything to happen. He almost never expected anything to happen at events like this. That was the point of events like this. He was 40 minutes in, standing beside a senator whose name he kept forgetting, holding a champagne flute he hadn't touched, when he saw her. She was across the room, near the catering station, wearing a charcoal blazer over a simple black dress, her natural hair pinned back in a way that was practical rather than styled. She was holding a clipboard. Not a drink. A clipboard. Her eyes were moving across the room in the steady, methodical sweep of someone managing logistics, not attending. She looked exactly like what she was. Someone who worked here. Dante's mind did not go blank. That would have been merciful. Instead, it went very, very quiet, in the way that rooms go quiet when every sound has suddenly been sucked out of them, and then it started cataloging, fast and without his permission. The line of her jaw, the way she tilted her head slightly left when she was processing something, the small tension at the corners of her mouth that meant she was holding something back. 12 years. She looked, not the same, not exactly, older. More contained. Whatever openness had lived in her face back then had been replaced by something measured and deliberate. But it was her. There was not a version of his life where he would have failed to recognize Naomi Ashford at 40 feet in a crowded room. She hadn't seen him yet. He watched her cross to a young woman in a headset, exchange 3 sentences, take a folded sheet from the clipboard and hand it over, then move toward the east corridor. Efficient, invisible. The way service staff learn to be invisible at events where no one is supposed to notice them working. Dante set his untouched champagne on the nearest passing tray and followed. He caught up with her in the corridor outside the secondary kitchen, where the catering team was running food. "Naomi!" She stopped. Her back was to him. For a moment, maybe 2 seconds, maybe less. She didn't turn around. He watched her shoulders do something small and complex, like a person making a decision they already knew the outcome of. Then she turned. Her face was composed. That was the first thing he registered. Not shocked, not guilty. not afraid, composed, in the way of someone who had thought through this exact moment and decided in advance how to wear it. "Mr. Moretti," she said. The formality hit him like a hand flat on the chest. "That's how we're doing this," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm working." Her voice was even. "This isn't a good time. 12 years in a corridor isn't a good time. I need to get back. What are you doing here?" He wasn't angry yet. He was something under anger, something that hadn't found its name. "You're working a gala event. You, Naomi Ashford." "Naomi Ashford works for Hartwell Senior Living," she said. "We're a nonprofit. The Whitmore Foundation is one of our donors. They asked us to help coordinate tonight." She glanced past his shoulder toward the kitchen door. "I really do need to go." "You're not going anywhere." The word she was about to say died in her throat, not because he'd raised his voice. He hadn't, but something in his tone. 12 years of becoming the kind of man whose tones carried weight reached her. "I'm not doing this here," she said quietly. "You pick the where," he said, "but we're talking." She looked at him for a long moment, reading him the same way she always had, that careful lateral quality to her attention that had once made him feel genuinely understood and now made him feel dissected. "I'm done at 11, she said finally. "There's a coffee place on 28th that's open late. Moreno's." "I'll be there." She turned and walked back into the organized chaos of the catering corridor without looking back. He stood in the hallway and listened to the sounds of the gala bleeding through the walls and tried to remember how to breathe at a normal rate. She didn't come. He sat at a corner table at Moreno's until 12:15, drank 2 coffees he didn't need, watched the door. The counter staff stopped pretending not to watch him. Watched the door sometime around midnight. At 12:20, he paid and left. In the car, Marco glanced at him in the rearview mirror once and had the professional instinct to say nothing. Dante stared at the rain-blurred city moving past the window and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Genuinely stupid. Not outmaneuvered. He was outmaneuvered regularly, and it had stopped bothering him because it was part of the work. Stupid. As in, he had sat in a coffee shop for an hour waiting for a woman who had already made her calculation about him 12 years ago, and some portion of him had actually believed she would show up. "Find out who she is now," he said. Marco's eyes didn't move in the mirror. "Who?" "Naomi Ashford. She's operations management at a place called Hartwell Senior Living. Pull everything. Where she lives, where she came from, how she ended up there. Clean and quiet. I don't want her spooked." "Timeline?" "Yesterday." "Did." The file came back in 4 days. Dante read it at his desk at 2 in the morning with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for acquisition contracts and threat assessments. Naomi Ashford, 39 years old. Born in Baltimore, grew up in D.C. Graduated early from Howard with a degree in healthcare administration. Moved to New York at 23, which was when they'd met, though the file didn't know that part. She'd worked at Hartwell Senior Living for 9 years, worked her way from administrative coordinator to operations director. She lived in a rent-stabilized apartment in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. No car, public transit. Her annual salary from Hartwell was $54,000. The nonprofit's operating budget was thin enough that his company spent more on monthly parking fees for executive staff. No significant relationships on record. No social media presence to speak of. A dormant profile from years ago and nothing since. A small circle of friends, mostly coworkers. She visited a doctor in Park Slope every 3 months for what his man noted were follow-up appointments, without specifying for what. He flipped back through the file. Nothing about wealth. Nothing about the man she'd left with, a man named Carver Webb, who had been new money and obvious ambition, and who had apparently been standing outside the restaurant where Dante had watched her climb into his car on a November night 12 years ago, laughing, reaching back to touch the man's arm. Dante had turned away. He hadn't needed to see more. He'd understood what he was looking at. He picked up the phone and called his investigator directly. "The medical follow-ups," he said. "What are they for?" A pause, the sound of papers. "Looks like post-surgical monitoring, long-term. There's a notation from a specialist at Langone. She had a partial hepatectomy about 8 years ago." Dante was quiet. That's a liver surgery, the investigator added carefully. Partial resection. She donated a segment, living donor procedure. Who was the recipient? Another pause, longer this time. The records are sealed, the man said. Living donor records almost always are. But the hospital, the timing, I can try to cross-reference if you want me to dig. Dig, Dante said, and find out where Carver Webb is now. Shepo. He found her himself before the investigator finished. He didn't plan it. He'd had people follow her movement patterns purely as a security protocol. Standard practice when an unknown quantity re-entered his proximity. When his surveillance team reported she'd arrived at Hartwell Senior Living at 7:40 on a Wednesday morning, he had Marco drive him to the same block. He walked in off the street. The facility was modest, clean, well-maintained, but the kind of clean that came from care rather than money. The lobby smelled like floor wax and old coffee, and something floral someone had made an effort with. A woman at the front desk smiled at him in the automatic way of someone trained to smile at everyone. "I'm here to see the operations director," he said. "Ms. Ashford, do you have an appointment?" "No." "Can I get your name?" "Dante Moretti." He watched the name land. It didn't, not the way it would have in his own world. Here it was just a name. He almost respected the place for that. The woman picked up the phone, had a brief murmured exchange, set it down. "She'll be right out," she said. Naomi appeared 2 minutes later from a back hallway, already wearing the same careful composure she'd had at the gala. Today, she was in slacks and a plain white blouse, reading glasses pushed up on her head, a travel mug in one hand. She looked at him and then looked at the lobby around him as if checking whether he'd brought anyone. "Can we talk in your office?" he said. She considered him for a moment. Then she said, "Follow me," and turned without waiting. Her office was small and relentlessly functional. Stacks of binders, a whiteboard covered in a color-coded calendar system, a dying plant on the windowsill that someone kept watering out of stubbornness. She closed the door behind them and went to her desk and stood behind it. Didn't sit, didn't offer him a seat. He sat anyway. "You didn't come last night," he said. "No." "Why not?" "Because there's nothing useful that conversation produces." She set her travel mug down on the desk and crossed her arms, not defensively. More like she was holding herself in a specific configuration that required effort. "Dante, you're clearly doing very well. I'm clearly doing very different. There's no version of catching up that ends well for either of us." "I'm not interested in catching up." "Then what do you want?" "An explanation." She was quiet. "You left," he said. "1 week before we were supposed to go. You cleared out your apartment, got in a car with Carver Webb, and you were gone. I stood across the street and watched it happen, and I spent 12 years understanding it as a choice you made." He kept his voice flat. This was important. He needed it flat. "And now you're here, working a nonprofit job in Brooklyn. So either the Webb thing didn't go the way you planned, or you made a series of very strange life choices after walking away from someone who was going to give you a very different life." "I didn't want the life you were going to give me." "That's not—" "I didn't want it," she said again, quieter this time. Not defensive, not cruel, just even. "And I can't explain more than that." He looked at her for a long time. The dying plant, the whiteboard, the dark circles under her eyes that the careful composure couldn't quite cover. "I'm going to find out what happened," he said. "My people are already pulling records. I have very good people." Something moved behind her eyes, brief, gone fast, but he'd been reading people in rooms for 20 years, and he caught it. "There's nothing to find," she said. "Then you have nothing to worry about." He stood, adjusted his jacket, looked at her once more across the small, cluttered room. "You should know," he said, "that the fact that you're standing here instead of being afraid of me tells me more than you probably wanted it to." He left before she could answer. The Carver Webb thread closed fast. Webb had moved to London 8 years ago, married someone from finance, and had no apparent contact with Naomi since not long after they'd arrived in New York together. The investigator flagged that Webb had made a wire transfer to Naomi's account roughly 10 years ago. A single payment, substantial for a woman on her income at the time, origin listed as a returned personal loan, not a kept woman, not a love affair, a transaction. What had been the transaction? The liver donation came back 3 days later. His investigator called at 6 in the morning. Dante was already awake. The partial hepatectomy, the man said. I cross-referenced against Langone's transplant program records from the same period, specifically high-compatibility living donor cases. There were 4 that year matching the timeline and tissue type. A pause. One of the recipients was a young woman named Carla Moretti, admitted under a different name for privacy reasons, but the financial guarantor records. Dante stopped hearing the rest of the sentence. Carla, his younger sister, 23 years old when she'd gotten sick, no match within the family. Their father had been quietly, desperately pulling every string available, and Dante had been furious at his own uselessness, the one problem in his life that money and fear couldn't solve. A compatible living donor had appeared through the hospital's program at the last moment. Identity sealed per protocol. Carla had recovered. Dante had donated to Langone's transplant ward every year since in a gesture that was equal parts gratitude and superstition, never asking questions because asking questions would have made it feel more fragile. He sat down. Which was not something he did mid-conversation. What else? He said. His voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere underwater. There's more, the investigator said carefully. The hospice. Dante's mother had died 3 years after Carla's surgery. The Moretti family had found a private hospice facility outside New Haven for her final months. Expensive, discreet, the bills paid through a family trust. His father had handled it personally, or so Dante had believed. Someone was paying supplemental charges, the investigator said. The trust covered the base contract, but there were additional payments coming in. Specialist consultations, upgraded pain management protocols, a private music therapist your mother apparently requested in her second month. The payments came through a nonprofit conduit that traced back eventually to an account controlled by a woman using the name N. Ashford. Dante's hand tightened around the phone. She also visited, the man said. Signed in under a different name each time. Staff records show a young woman visited your mother 11 times over the 7 months she was there. No family member ever recognized her. The name she used in the visitor log was the sound of pages. Rebecca Cole. Dante breathed. He breathed in and he breathed out, and he sat in the 6 a.m. quiet of his office and tried to hold what he was learning in both hands without dropping it. Naomi Ashford had donated part of her liver to save his sister, while he was turning into the man he'd become partly because of what he believed she'd done to him. She had given a piece of her body to save Carla, and then she had quietly paid for every comfort his mother had in her final months, and she had sat in a chair in that facility and visited a dying woman whose son thought Naomi was halfway around the world living a better life. And she hadn't told anyone. Not Carla, not the family, not him. 11 visits. He stood up from the chair, walked to the window. The morning was gray and undecided outside. Keep going, he said. Whatever else is there, I want it all. He went back to Hartwell 3 days later. He didn't call ahead. She was in her office again, this time actually sitting at the desk, reading something on her laptop with the focused frown she used to get when she was working through a problem. She looked up when he appeared in the open doorway, and for the first time since the gala, something in her composure cracked, just a fraction. She knew. He could tell she knew that he knew, whatever he knew. The crack in her composure told him. He closed the door behind him and sat in the same chair as before. They were quiet for a moment. You gave part of your liver to my sister, he said. She looked at her laptop screen. Didn't close it, didn't answer. 11 visits to my mother, he said. 7 months. Rebecca Cole. She closed the laptop then, set her hands flat on the desk. I need to understand, he said. His voice was doing something he didn't fully control. I need you to explain to me what that was, Naomi. Because the story I've been carrying around for 12 years has you as a very specific character, and the files I've been reading for the past week are telling me I invented that character from whole cloth, and I cannot... He stopped, started again. I cannot reconcile those two things without your help. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, You should go, Dante. That's not... I know what you found, and I know what you're trying to make it mean. Her voice was quiet and careful, and there was something in it that sounded less like coldness than like a person standing at the very edge of something and gripping the railing hard. But knowing those things doesn't change what was necessary. It just gives them names. Who made it necessary? He asked. Who told you to go? She stood up, picked up her travel mug, walked to the window and stood with her back to him. You need to go, she said again. He stood. He crossed the room slowly and stopped behind her, not touching her, just close enough that she'd know he was there. I'm going to find the rest of it, he said. You can tell me now, or I find it my way. But I'm going to know everything, Naomi. Every piece. She didn't turn around. He waited. 10 seconds. 15. Then he left. He was in the elevator going down when his phone buzzed with a message from his investigator. 3 words. Found the letters. Dante stared at those 3 words all the way to the lobby and out through the glass doors and into the cold October air where Marco was waiting with the car. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up at the building, at the unremarkable brick and glass of a nonprofit senior living facility, and felt the ground under everything he'd built and everything he'd believed shift in a way he recognized from a long time ago. The last time the ground had shifted like this, it had taken him 12 years to find his footing. He was not going to let it take that long again. He got in the car. Where to? Marco said. Home, Dante said. I need to read some letters. The letters were in a manila envelope that his investigator had obtained through channels Dante chose not to ask about. 7 of them. Handwritten. Different dates spanning roughly 3 months, all from the same period, the weeks before Naomi disappeared. None of them were addressed to Dante. They were addressed to Naomi. He read them at his kitchen table at midnight with a glass of water he forgot to drink. No scotch tonight. He wanted to be completely clear for this. The handwriting was controlled and deliberate, the penmanship of someone who had learned it formally and kept the habit. The letters were not signed with a full name, just an initial. L. The content, read in sequence, assembled itself into something that felt less like correspondence and more like a slow, methodical tightening of a trap. The first letter was polite, almost warm. It established that the writer knew about Dante and Naomi's plans, knew the date, the destination, the logistics, knew about the apartment deposit Dante had placed under a clean name in a coastal town in Maine, knew things that only 2 people in the world should have known. The second letter was still polite, but the warmth was gone. It laid out, with surgical precision, what would happen to Dante if Naomi stayed. Not a threat exactly, more like a forecast. A weather report for a storm the writer claimed to see coming from a long way off. There were factions inside the Moretti organization, the letter said, that were waiting for a specific trigger. Dante taking a civilian wife, a black woman, from outside any family structure they recognized, with no leverage and no protection, would be that trigger. The writer described, in plain language, what those factions had historically done to women in that position. The third letter included photographs. Dante stared at those for a long time. Surveillance photographs of Naomi herself, taken without her knowledge at various points in her daily life. Her walking to the subway, sitting in a coffee shop, standing outside the building where she and Dante had their first real conversation. The message of the photographs was not stated anywhere in the letter. It didn't need to be. The fourth letter introduced the offer. She would be given a safe exit. Money, enough to start over somewhere clean. Help from someone named Carver Webb, who would provide cover and transport and the appearance of a choice being made freely. In exchange, she would disappear completely. No contact with Dante, no explanation. She would let him believe whatever the scene was designed to make him believe. The fifth letter was a response. Different handwriting, Naomi's. He recognized it immediately, and something in his chest did something physical and unpleasant. She wrote, "I won't do this. You can't make me do this. If there are people inside the organization who would hurt me, Dante needs to know. He has the right to protect himself from what's inside his own family." The sixth letter, back to L, was brief. Just 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph explained that Dante would not be the one in danger if she stayed. She would. And then, once she was gone, the destabilization of the organization would begin, and Dante, who was still viewed by certain parties as too soft, too compromised by emotion, would be consumed by the resulting power struggle. The writer stated it plainly. Your presence keeps him human. Human men do not survive what is coming. I am offering you the chance to save his life by removing yourself from it. This is not a threat. This is mathematics. The second paragraph said, there is also the matter of his sister. I know what Carla's prognosis is. I know the family has found no donor match. I have information about a compatibility that has not yet been explored. Cooperate, and I will make sure that information reaches the right people. Dante set the 6th letter down. He sat there for a while. Outside, the city made its sounds. Somewhere below, a car alarm cycled through its sequence and stopped. The refrigerator hummed. Normal sounds. The sounds of a world that didn't know it had just been restructured. He picked up the 7th letter. It was short. Naomi's handwriting again. 3 lines. I understand. I'll be gone by the 15th. Leave Carla's information with the hospital under Dr. Reyes. Don't contact me again. No signature. Dante folded the letters back in their original creases and put them in the envelope and set the envelope on the table and looked at it for a long time. Then he called Marco. I need you to find me everything we have on the initial letter writer, he said. The initial is L. The letters were routed through a private courier service in Midtown, so there will be a paper trail somewhere if you go back far enough. Cross-reference anyone with access to my personal logistics from 12 years ago. The main deposit, the travel plans. The number of people who knew those details was very small. Marco was quiet on the other end. You understand what I'm looking at, Dante said. It wasn't a question. I think so, Marco said carefully. Then you understand why I need a name before I do anything else. I'll start tonight. Dante hung up, picked up the envelope, put it in his inside jacket pocket because leaving it on the table felt wrong, felt like leaving a body unattended. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the kitchen until the city outside went from black to gray to pale morning gold, and he thought about a girl in a green raincoat laughing in the rain and what it cost to laugh like that while carrying the weight of what she'd been carrying and the distance between the man he'd become and the man he might have been if she'd been able to stay. He was at Hartwell at 8:15. She was already there. Of course she was. He was learning that Naomi Ashford arrived early to things and stayed late and did the work that made other people's jobs possible without requiring acknowledgement for any of it. He was learning this about her like he was learning everything else right now. Too late and too fast. And with the particular sick clarity of a man who has been wrong about something load-bearing for a very long time. She was in the small break room off the main corridor, standing at a coffee maker when he walked in. She turned, registered him, and turned back to the coffee maker. Poured. Did not offer him a cup. I read them, he said. Her hand tightened around the mug for a moment. Then she turned and leaned against the counter and looked at him the way she'd been looking at him, carefully, from a distance that had nothing to do with how close they were standing. All 7, he said. Then you know what there is to know. I know what's in 7 letters. I don't know who L is. She drank her coffee, said nothing. Naomi. He kept his voice level. This took more effort than he would have admitted to anyone. Someone in my family engineered your disappearance. They used Carla as leverage. They had surveillance on you that suggests resources and access that narrows the field considerably. He paused. Help me narrow it further. It doesn't matter who it was. It matters enormously who it was. It was 12 years ago. She set the mug down on the counter and crossed her arms. The organization has changed. The people who were positioned to do something like that, most of them aren't in the same places anymore. Your father is gone. The old structure is gone. Whatever power that letter writer had is potentially still being exercised, Dante said, by someone who has been inside my operation for 12 years, watching me, while knowing exactly what they did to you and why. She was quiet. "That person knows I know you're back in New York," he said, "because they have eyes everywhere I have eyes, and they have since before I knew how to count them, which means right now, as we stand here, whoever wrote those letters is watching this conversation happen and making calculations." He watched her think through this. He watched the composure she wore like armor do something complicated. Not crack, but flex. "I can't give you a name," she said. "Can't or won't?" "Can't." Something shifted in her voice. The evenness thinned just slightly. "I never knew who L was. The letters came through Webb. He was the intermediary. He didn't tell me where they originated. And you didn't push. I had photographs of myself taken from 20 feet away without my knowledge, Dante. I had a letter that told me Carla was going to die without a donor that someone was withholding to use as a bargaining chip." Her voice was still controlled, but something under it was pressing upward. "I was 27 years old, and someone inside the most dangerous family in New York had decided I was a problem. I wasn't pushing for a name. I was trying to survive." He stood there. She was right. He knew she was right, which was the part that made it hard to stand still in the small room. "Webb," he said, "what's your contact with him now?" "Zero. We haven't spoken in years." "He's in London." "I know. I can reach him." She looked at him sharply. "Don't. Naomi, he made a decision 12 years ago to help me get out of something that could have gotten me killed. Whatever his reasons were, he helped me. If you go after him, I'm not going after him. I want to talk to him. Your version of talking to people and the normal human version of that are not the same thing." He almost said something to that, decided against it. She wasn't wrong about that either. "Then help me find another thread," he said, "because I'm going to find out who wrote those letters. The only question is whether you're part of how I get there or whether you watch me do it from a distance and deal with whatever happens next." She looked at him for a long moment. The coffee maker made a sound. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. "There was one thing," she said finally, "in the fourth letter. The writer mentioned a specific date, not for the plan but for something else. He said the transfer would be handled on the same day as the Velasco negotiation because the timing would provide adequate cover." She paused. "At the time, I didn't know what the Velasco negotiation was, but he said it as if I should." Dante went very still. The Velasco negotiation 12 years ago had been the first major deal his father had ever let him lead. He had been enormously proud of that. He had told almost no one. It wasn't the kind of thing you discussed outside very tight circles. The identity of the people at that table was sensitive. The people who knew about the Velasco negotiation from 12 years ago formed a very short list. "Thank you," he said. "Dante." She stepped forward, just slightly, just enough. "Whatever you find, be careful what you do with it. Not for my sake, for yours." "I'm always careful." "You're never careful," she said quietly. "You're precise. Those aren't the same thing." He left. The name came 3 days later. Marco called at 10 in the morning while Dante was in a meeting with 2 corporate attorneys who immediately understood from the change in his face that the meeting was over. He took the call in the hallway. "Webb had a holding account," Marco said. "London Private Bank. The payments to facilitate Naomi's exit came through a trust. I traced the trust through 4 layers. It's slow work because whoever set it up knew what they were doing. But the originating signatory on the founding documents, 12 years back..." Marco paused. "It's Lucien." Dante stood in the hallway of his own building and felt the air go out of him in a way that was completely invisible on the outside. Lucien Moretti, his half-brother. 4 years younger, his father's son from a relationship the old man had maintained in parallel with his marriage for 11 years, before it became too complex to sustain. Lucien had been brought formally into the family when he was 16. He was charming in the easy, effortless way of someone who had grown up needing to be charming to survive. He was brilliant with logistics, with people, with the kind of soft influence that left no fingerprints. He had sat at Carla's bedside during her recovery. He had given a toast at their mother's memorial. He called Dante brother with a warmth that had always seemed genuine. "You're certain," Dante said. "3 independent traces to the same documents," Marco said. "I'm certain." Dante looked at the wall across from him, a framed photograph of the Manhattan skyline that some interior designer had chosen. He looked at it without seeing it. "Where is he right now?" he said. "His townhouse in the West Village. He's having lunch with 2 of the shipping division's senior people in—" The sound of checking. 40 minutes. "Pull his surveillance access," Dante said. "All of it. The eyes he has inside our network. Find them and shut them down without tipping him that we've moved. Today. Before that lunch is over. If I do that, he'll know something's wrong the moment he tries to access—" "He'll know something's wrong," Dante said. "I want him to know something's wrong. I want him sitting across from those shipping people feeling something uncomfortable he can't identify." He paused. "But I don't want him to know it's me. Not yet." "Understood." "And Marco. Nobody else on this. Not the lieutenants, not the legal team, nobody until I know who he's been talking to inside the organization for 12 years. We have a contamination problem, and I don't know the shape of it yet." "Got it." Dante hung up and stood in the hallway a moment longer. Then he went back into the conference room where the 2 attorneys were sitting in uncomfortable silence and said, "We're done for today," without further explanation, and walked to the elevator. He went to see Carla. She lived in a brownstone in Cobble Hill with her husband and 2 kids who were both still young enough to think their Uncle Dante was simply a man who wore nice suits and always brought the good pastries. He didn't call ahead. She opened the door in a paint-stained sweatshirt with a child's artwork in one hand and read his face in about 3 seconds. "Come in," she said. The kids were at school. Her husband was at work. She made coffee without asking whether he wanted any because in their family, coffee was not a question, it was a response. They sat at her kitchen table, comfortable, slightly chaotic, smelling like old wood and crayon wax and the good life she'd built, and he tried to work out where to start. "You look like you did when Papa died," she said. "That specific kind of awful." "I need to ask you something about your surgery," he said. She went still. Not frightened. Carla had never been easily frightened, but alert. "The donor," he said. "You were told it was an anonymous match through the program." "That's what Dr. Reyes told me, yes." "Did you ever try to find out who it was?" She looked at him carefully. "Once, early on, Dr. Reyes said the donor had explicitly requested no contact be made. I respected that." She set her mug down. "Why?" he told her. "Not everything, not the letters, not the full architecture of it, but the core of it, that the donor had been someone he knew, and that this person had done it without asking for anything, and that the information had only come to light recently." Carla listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Who?" she asked. "That's not the part that matters right now." "Dante." "Carla." She accepted this with the patience of someone who had been his sister for 40 years and knew exactly which arguments were worth Woolton having. "Is she okay?" she asked instead. Something in his throat tightened. "She's all right, yes." Carla nodded, looked at her coffee mug. "Does she know that she—" She gestured vaguely at herself, at the kitchen, at the 2 kids' rain boots lined up by the back door. "She knows," he said. Carla pressed her lips together. Her eyes were doing something she wasn't going to let become visible. "I've thought about that donor a lot," she said. "Over the years, whoever it was, they just decided that my life was worth part of their body. A stranger." She stopped, breathed. "Or not a stranger." "Not a stranger," he said. She nodded again. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I don't know yet." "That's not true." He looked at her. "You know exactly what you're going to do," she said. "You came here to tell me first. That's why you're here, isn't it? You're not asking me anything. You're telling me something is about to happen and you wanted me to hear it from you." He didn't answer. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly, the way she had when they were kids, and something was wrong, and there was nothing useful to say. "Okay?" she said. Be smart. I'm always smart. You're always effective, she said. Smart is different. He squeezed her hand once and stood up. He was at the door when she said, Dante? He stopped. Didn't turn. Lucien came by last week, she said. He wanted to know if I'd seen you recently, whether you seemed distracted. Dante stood in the doorway of his sister's kitchen with his back to her and let that sit for a moment. What did you tell him? He said. I said you seemed exactly like yourself. A pause. I said that because at the time it was true. Now I'm wondering if I should have said something different. You said the right thing, he said. Don't contact him. Don't tell him I was here. He left. In the car, he sat for a moment before telling Marco where to go. He was thinking about Lucien at the memorial, standing at the microphone with the easy grief of a man who understood exactly how to perform loss. He was thinking about every conversation over 12 years where Lucien had positioned himself at the right angle, the right distance, always helpful, always warm, always slightly farther inside the operation than any given moment seemed to require. He was thinking about 12 years of thinking he'd been broken by a woman who had chosen to leave him, when what had actually broken him was a lie, a manufactured loss, someone who had looked at him and decided that grief would make him more useful than love. Hatred made you easier to control than love ever could. The phrase came to him as if he'd already read it somewhere, which he hadn't, not yet. But it felt exactly right. It felt like the sentence that explained the previous 12 years of his life. His phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He let it ring twice more, then answered. Silence on the other end. Then a voice he knew, smooth, warm, carrying that particular quality of concerned surprise he'd always trusted without examining. Dante, Lucien said, we need to talk. The line went dead. Dante looked at the phone in his hand, then looked out the car window at the street moving past, and felt something he recognized from very early in his career. The specific sensation of a situation contracting around you, the walls coming in from multiple sides at once. The moment just before you either break or decide exactly how hard you're willing to hit back. Marco, he said. Yeah. Lucien just called me. Silence. Then, what did he say? 2 words and a hang-up. Dante set the phone face down on the seat. He knows I've been pulling threads. He doesn't know how many or how far. He paused. Get me everything on his movements for the last 72 hours. Every meeting, every call, every face he's been in a room with. And put 2 quiet people on Naomi tonight. Don't tell her. Just make sure she's covered. You think he'd move on her? Dante thought about the 3rd letter, the photographs, the surveillance of a 27-year-old woman taken without her knowledge by someone who had already decided she was expendable. He's done it before, Dante said, when he thought it was useful. Marco said nothing. And pull the recordings from the Velasco closing dinner, Dante said. 12 years ago. The internal recording, I know my father kept one. It should be in the archive vault at the Riverside property. He watched the city move past the glass. If Lucien was in that room, there'll be a record of what he knew and when he knew it. And if the recording confirms it? Dante looked at his own reflection in the window. The jaw, the eyes, the face of a man who had built himself into something specific and deliberate over 12 years using the wrong blueprint entirely. Then I'll have everything I need, he said, to finish this the right way. The archive vault at the Riverside property smelled like old paper and machine oil, and the particular staleness of a room that had been sealed for years at a time and opened only when the past needed to be consulted. Dante stood in the middle of it at 11 at night with a flashlight and a pair of latex gloves, and the knowledge that his father had been pathologically meticulous about documentation, not out of sentimentality, but because the old man had believed that information was the only currency that never devalued. The vault ran the length of the basement's east wall. Metal shelving, labeled in his father's handwriting on yellowed index cards, organized by year, then by category: acquisitions, personnel, legal, internal. Dante moved along the shelving with the flashlight until he found the year he needed, then the subcategory: internal/recordings/executive. The recording was on a physical drive, old format, sealed in a clear evidence bag with a date written in marker across the front, his father's handwriting. He'd have to get it converted to play it, which meant a delay of at least a day. He was reaching for it when he saw the second drive. Same shelf, same year, different label. This one said Riverside/emergency/LM, personal. LM Lucien Moretti. He took both drives. The conversion took 18 hours. He used a technician from outside his normal network, a retired forensic audio specialist who worked out of a cluttered office in Astoria and charged too much and asked no questions. Dante sat in the waiting area of the man's office on a metal chair and drank bad coffee from a machine and did not use his phone. He needed the 18 hours to think without talking to anyone. What he knew, Lucien had orchestrated Naomi's exit. Lucien had used Carla's medical condition as leverage. Lucien had maintained surveillance access inside the Moretti operation for at minimum 12 years. Lucien had called him 2 days ago with 2 words and a hang-up, which was either a warning or a test or both. What he didn't know, how deep the contamination went. Which of his current lieutenants had been feeding information to Lucien and for how long? Whether the call had triggered a response Dante wasn't yet aware of. What he was afraid of, underneath everything, that the second drive would show him something that extended the conspiracy further back than he'd calculated. His father had been dead for 6 years, his mother longer. If the old man had known what Lucien did and had allowed it, the whole foundation of the version of events Dante had been operating from would have to be rebuilt from the ground up, and he wasn't sure what would be left to stand on when that was done. The technician emerged at 4 in the afternoon and handed him 2 audio files on a clean device without making eye contact. Dante drove to the Riverside property, sat in the empty kitchen of the house his father had owned, pressed play. The Velasco recording was 90 minutes long. Business. His own voice at 29, younger, less controlled, still carrying some edge of the man he'd been trying not to become. His father's voice, measured, faintly accented, exact. Other voices around a table. The Velasco counterparts, his father's consigliere, and Lucien, present at the table. Dante had forgotten, or had chosen not to examine the memory carefully, that Lucien had been in the room for the Velasco closing. He'd been 25, new to formal participation in executive meetings. He'd said almost nothing during the recorded session. But in the breaks between formal discussion, when the room relaxed into the ambient sound of people refilling glasses and exchanging small talk, Dante heard something he'd had no way to register at the time. Lucien, quiet, to someone beside him. After tonight, he's fully committed. He won't take the exit, not with this on the table. An unidentified voice, lower. And the woman? Lucien. Handled. Timeline set. By the time he knows she's gone, the Velasco integration will need his full attention. Grief is useful. Grief focuses people. The unidentified voice said something Dante couldn't fully make out. Then Lucien again, almost too soft to catch. He needs to be angry, not heartbroken. So it has to look like a choice she made. Dante stopped the recording. He sat in his dead father's kitchen and looked at the wall and breathed in and breathed out and did the thing he'd trained himself to do over 20 years of high-stakes situations. He put the feeling in a box, and he put the box somewhere he could find it later, and he focused on what the information meant rather than what it did to him. What it meant? Lucien had planned this before the Velasco meeting. It hadn't been a reactive decision, not a response to circumstances. It had been engineered in advance with specific psychological goals. He hadn't simply wanted Naomi gone. He'd wanted Dante angry. He'd understood at 25 years old that a grieving Dante was a liability and a furious Dante was an asset, and he'd manufactured the emotion he needed with the precision of someone who had been studying his half-brother for years. He pressed play on the second drive. This one was shorter, 15 minutes, lower audio quality. Portable recorder, it sounded like. The date embedded in the file metadata was 2 years after the first recording, his father's voice, Lucien's voice, a conversation that had clearly not been intended for the archive. The tone was different, unguarded in the way that people are when they believe they are completely alone. His father, "You should have told me before you moved on the girl." Lucien, there wasn't time. His father, there was time. You chose not to use it. Silence. His father again. You understand that if Dante ever finds out what you did, Lucian, he won't. He has no reason to look. He believes what he saw. He believes it now. People stop believing things, Lucian. They find threads. By the time he finds threads, he'll be so deep in the organization that pulling them will cost him more than leaving them alone. That's the architecture. That's how it works. A long silence. His father. The girl was innocent. Lucien without hesitation. Yes. That doesn't trouble you. Not a question, an observation. Lucien, it's not relevant. Another silence, longer. Then his father. You're going to tell him yourself someday. I want your word on that. Lucien, of course. The recording ended. Dante sat in the kitchen for a long time after that. His father had known. Not before, not during, but 2 years after. His father had known what Lucien did and had accepted the answer he won't find out, and had extracted a promise from his younger son that everyone in that conversation had understood was meaningless, and had let it rest. He had let it rest. Dante stood up. He did it carefully, like someone testing weight on an uncertain surface. He walked to the window of his dead father's kitchen and looked out at the property, the overgrown back garden, the dock at the edge of the water, the boat he'd been meaning to have serviced for 3 years. He was not angry. He had put that in the box. He would be angry later, in private, in a way that was his own business. Right now, he needed to make decisions. He called Naomi from the car on the drive back. She picked up on the third ring. He could hear the ambient sounds of her building. A door, a television from somewhere down a hallway. Are you home? He said. Yes. There are 2 people outside your building. They're mine. I need you to know that, so you're not alarmed. A beat. You put security on me. Yes. Without asking. Yes. She breathed. He could hear her deciding how to respond to this and making the decision to set it aside for the moment, which he respected. What did you find? She said. Recordings. 2 of them. He kept his eyes on the road. Lucien planned your removal before Velasco. It wasn't reactive. He designed the outcome in advance. He specifically wanted me angry rather than grieving because he'd calculated that anger was more useful for what he needed me to become. Silence on her end. My father knew, Dante said. Not until 2 years after. But he knew. More silence. Then, I'm sorry. Don't be sorry for me. Dante, I need to know if there's anything else, he said. Anything you remember from that time that felt wrong but that you dismissed. Anything Webb said that seemed like more than what it was. Any detail. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her thinking. There was a man, she said, at the bus station when I left. Webb introduced him as someone there to help with logistics. I never got a name, but he wasn't someone Webb would have known on his own. He was too polished, too careful. He felt like someone's employee. What did he look like? She described him. Medium height, early 40s at the time, very clean hands, a particular habit of standing slightly behind and to the left of whoever was speaking. The positioning of someone trained to be secondary. Dante knew exactly who that was. His name was Roland Voss. He had been Lucien's personal attaché for 15 years and was currently the operations coordinator for the Moretti Shipping Division's Eastern accounts. Okay, Dante said. Who is it? Someone I need to speak with tonight. Dante. Her voice shifted, not softer, but more direct. What are you going to do? I'm going to get a complete picture before I move. That's not what I asked. I know, he said. I'll call you tomorrow. He hung up, called Marco, gave him Roland Voss's address and 3 specific instructions about how the evening needed to go. Voss lived alone in a service apartment in Murray Hill, the kind of place that was nice enough to be comfortable and anonymous enough to suit a man whose job required invisibility. Dante arrived at 9:15 with Marco and one other man, a quiet veteran named Peso, who had been with the Moretti organization for 20 years and whose loyalty Dante had verified personally after the contamination question had surfaced. The door was unlocked. Not just unlocked, open. Standing slightly ajar, the light inside on, the apartment showing the specific signs of a rapid exit, a coffee cup on the counter half full, a jacket on the back of a chair, a phone, a second phone, a burner, lying face up on the kitchen table with its screen cracked as if it had been dropped in a hurry. Dante stood in the doorway and took this in. He ran, Marco said. He was warned, Dante said. He walked to the kitchen table and looked at the cracked burner without touching it. Someone told him I was coming. Lucien. Or someone reporting to Lucien who is still inside our communication channels. He looked at the coffee cup. Still faintly warm. 20 minutes, maybe 30. He didn't have much warning, just enough. Peso was moving through the apartment, checking rooms. He came back from the bedroom holding a manila envelope, the non-theatrical kind. Business size, slightly over full. Nightstand, he said. Back of the drawer. Dante took it. Inside, a USB drive, a folded document that turned out to be a property deed for something in New Jersey, and a handwritten note on a single sheet that read, in handwriting he didn't recognize, "If it comes to it, this is what you say. Memorize and destroy. L." Below that, a prepared statement, detailed, accounting for Voss's role in Naomi's removal 12 years ago, framed as independent action taken without Lucian's knowledge or authorization. A clean redirect, a carefully constructed alternate version in which Voss was the architect and Lucien was absent from the story entirely. Voss had been carrying his own cover story in a nightstand drawer, which meant Lucien had been preparing for this possibility. Not recently. The handwriting on the note matched the period-consistent ink and paper of something written years ago. Lucien had built the exit architecture into the operation from the beginning. He had prepared a man to take the fall if the structure was ever compromised, and now that man had run. "The USB," Marco said. Dante handed it to him. Marco produced a tablet, loaded the drive. Files, dozens of them. Communication records, financial transfers, internal memos. 12 years of documentation that Voss had apparently been accumulating as his own insurance policy. Dante scanned the first several files on the tablet screen and understood immediately that what he was looking at was not just evidence of what Lucien had done 12 years ago. It was a map of everything since. Every manipulation, every internal conversation steered, every lieutenant quietly positioned or repositioned, every federal contact managed. 12 years of architecture. And threaded through all of it, in communication after communication, a name that appeared with a frequency that made Dante's vision go slightly strange at the edges. Not Voss, not any of the lieutenants he'd suspected, his head of legal affairs. A man named Curtis Prine, who had been with the organization for 8 years, who had overseen every significant contract and regulatory interface, who sat in on the most sensitive internal discussions as a matter of professional necessity. Curtis Prine had been Lucien's primary conduit for the past 6 years. Dante had trusted him with the investigation records. He'd told Prine 3 days ago that he was pulling archive materials from Riverside. He looked at Marco. Marco had reached the same place in the files and was already looking back at him with the particular expression of a man who understood exactly what had gone wrong. He told Lucien about Riverside, Dante said, and Lucien warned Voss. Yes. Which means Lucien knows about the recordings. Yes. And he's known since at least 72 hours, Marco said. Dante stood in the empty apartment of a man who had run because he'd been given 30 minutes and decided 30 minutes was enough to disappear on, and he recalculated. Lucien had known for 3 days. In 3 days, a careful man who had been building contingency architecture for 12 years could move considerable resources. He could reposition. He could activate things that had been waiting to be activated. He could... Dante's phone rang. The number was Naomi's. He answered immediately. The voice on the other end was not Naomi's. It was Lucien's. Smooth, warm, carrying a new quality underneath it that Dante had never heard there before. something that might have been, on another man, desperation, but on Lucien came out as a kind of preternatural calm. "She's fine," Lucien said. "I want to be very clear about that first." Every muscle in Dante's body underwent a specific change. Not tensing, something beyond tension, something on the other side of it, where the body stops performing alarm and simply enters a different mode entirely. "Where is she?" Dante said. "Somewhere we can have a real conversation without your people in the way." A pause. "Which is all I've ever wanted, Dante. A real conversation. You've been pulling at things without talking to me. That's not how we do things. You have 60 seconds to tell me she's unharmed and give me a location." "She's unharmed. She'll stay that way as long as you come alone. No Marco, no Peso, no one from the security team." Another pause. "I'm not your enemy. I need you to understand that before we talk. Everything I did, every decision I did for the family. I did for you. I need you to hear that from me directly." "Location," Dante said. Lucien gave it. The old Moretti shipyard on the Staten Island waterfront, the property where the family's import operation had first been established, closed for years, sitting in a legal gray space while a development dispute worked its way through the courts, the place where the dynasty had begun. "Alone," Lucien said again, "or this gets complicated in ways neither of us wants." The line went dead. Dante stood in Roland Voss's empty apartment and looked at the cracked burner on the kitchen table and the coffee cup going cold on the counter and felt the situation complete itself around him. The walls Lucien had been building for 12 years, finally visible all the way to the ceiling, the architecture fully revealed now that he was standing inside it. He looked at Marco. "I need you to do exactly what I tell you," he said. "Not what you think is safer. Exactly what I say." Marco's jaw worked. He said alone. "He did. Dante, I know." He pocketed his phone. "Give me the tablet." He spent 4 minutes copying the most critical files from Voss's USB onto a separate device, a small encrypted drive he kept on his person. Insurance. The kind his father would have approved of, in the version of his father that existed before tonight's recording had complicated everything. He handed the tablet back to Marco and gave him 3 instructions, specific and sequential, with time markers. Marco listened without interrupting. When Dante was done, Marco said nothing for a moment. Then, "If the timing's off, it won't be off. But if it is, then we'll deal with that," Dante said. "But it won't be." He walked out of the apartment and took the stairs down to the street and got into the car alone. The drive to Staten Island was 40 minutes at this hour. He used the time to do something he hadn't done in a very long time. He let himself feel it, all of it, without the box, without the management. The full weight of 12 years built on a manufactured loss. His father's voice on a recording saying the girl was innocent and accepting it's not relevant as an answer. Carla's hand over his at her kitchen table. Naomi's 3-line letter. "I understand. I'll be gone by the 15th. He let himself feel it, and then he put it away. Not in the box this time, somewhere deeper. The kind of place you put things you intend to carry permanently rather than retrieve. He was not going to the shipyard to negotiate. He was not going to the shipyard to listen to Lucien explain that everything had been done for the family. He was going to the shipyard to finish something that had been started 12 years ago by a 25-year-old who had looked at his older brother's happiness and decided it was a strategic liability, and who had been living inside the architecture of that decision ever since, and who had just made the last miscalculation available to him, the one where he put his hands on the wrong person and called it leverage. The shipyard came into view through the windshield as the car crossed onto the waterfront road, dark, sprawling, rusted in the way of things that were once enormous and important and have been sitting in the weather ever since. Dante parked, turned off the engine, sat for one moment in the complete quiet. Then he got out of the car and walked toward the gates, and behind him the city lights reflected off the water in broken pieces, and somewhere inside the darkness of the old shipyard, his brother was waiting with a story prepared about why everything that had been done had been necessary, and Dante walked forward into that darkness with the specific resolve of a man who has finally stopped carrying someone else's version of his own life. The gate was open. Deliberately, theatrically open. Lucien had always understood the value of staging. Dante moved through the outer yard, past rusted shipping containers and collapsed equipment shelters, following the light sources deeper into the compound until he reached the main warehouse floor. High ceilings, broken skylights, the smell of salt water and corroded metal. Work lights had been set up at intervals, powered by a portable generator humming somewhere in the dark. Naomi was sitting in a chair near the center of the floor, not bound, not visibly harmed, but two men stood within close proximity, and the positioning was unambiguous. She looked at him when he entered. Her face was controlled in the way he recognized, composure worn like armor, but her eyes did something brief and complicated when she saw him. Not relief exactly. Something more like recognition. Like she'd been waiting and had known he would come and hadn't been certain whether that was a good thing until this exact moment. Lucien stood 20 feet beyond her. He was dressed well, as always. The easy elegance of a man who had never needed to announce himself because he'd always understood that real power moves quietly. He looked, for the first time in Dante's memory, slightly diminished. Not afraid, but aware. "You came alone," Lucien said. "I did what you asked," Dante said. "Now release her." "When we've talked. We're talking now. Release her." Lucien studied him for a moment, then nodded to the two men. They stepped back. Naomi stood immediately, moved away from the chair, and positioned herself to Dante's left without being told to. He registered this without looking at her directly. "The recordings," Lucien said. "I know you found them." "I know you know." "Then you know I can explain." "I heard you explain," Dante said. "On the recording, 2 years after. Papa asked if it troubled you, and you said it wasn't relevant." He took one step forward. "There's nothing left to explain, Lucien. There's only what happens next." Something moved behind Lucien's eyes. The calculation he'd always been running, trying to find the angle. "I made you," Lucien said quietly. "The man you became, but the strength, the position, all of it. I built the conditions for that. You were going to walk away. I kept you." "You broke me," Dante said, "and called it architecture." Lucien opened his mouth. Dante reached into his jacket and produced the encrypted drive and held it where Lucien could see it clearly. "Voss kept records," Dante said. "Everything. 12 years. Prine's communications, the federal contacts, the redirected accounts." He paused. "You're done, Lucien. The only question you get to answer tonight is whether you walk out of here or get carried." The generator hummed. Water moved somewhere outside against the old dock pilings. Lucien looked at the drive, and for the first time in 41 years of knowing him, Dante watched his brother run out of moves. Lucien moved first, not toward Dante, sideways, a half step that repositioned him relative to the two men behind him, and Dante caught the signal in it immediately. The small physical vocabulary of a man giving an instruction without using his voice. The man on the left went for the weapon at his hip. Dante was already moving. He covered the distance between himself and the nearer man in 4 steps, got inside the draw, took the wrist with both hands and broke the angle before the gun cleared the holster. The man was large and trained, and his reaction was fast, but Dante had spent 20 years being in rooms where things went wrong, and his body had its own curriculum at this point. He stripped the weapon, turned it, put the man between himself and the second guard. The second guard fired anyway. The shot went wide. Deliberately wide, Dante registered, because Lucien was somewhere in the line of trajectory, and the guard adjusted at the last second, which cost him the angle. Dante put the first man down with the butt of the stripped weapon against the back of his skull, dropped behind a rusted equipment casing, and assessed. Lucien had moved during the shot. He was near the east wall now, another 20 feet back, in the shadows where the work lights didn't reach. The second guard had repositioned behind a stack of old pallets. Professional spacing. They'd used the space before, or someone had walked it in advance. Dante looked left. Naomi had gone flat against the warehouse wall. Not panicked, not frozen, but low and moving laterally toward the back exit he'd clocked when he came in. Good. He needed her out of the geometry. The second guard came around the pallets fast and low. Dante threw himself right, took the impact on his shoulder against the concrete floor, felt something in the joint protest violently, and rolled. The guard's shot hit the equipment casing where his head had been. He came up firing twice. Controlled, center mass, and the guard went down hard and didn't move. Silence crashed back into the warehouse like something physical. The generator hummed, water against the dock pilings. Dante's own breathing, faster than he wanted it. He stood up slowly. His shoulder was a problem. Not dislocated, he didn't think, but the joint was screaming in a way that would become a serious conversation in about an hour. He ignored it. The body had its complaints, and it could file them later. "Lucien," he said. His voice carried in the warehouse space the way voices do in empty industrial buildings. Too far, too clear, stripped of everything that normally cushions sound. No answer from the east wall shadows. Dante moved. Not toward where Lucien had been, toward where Lucien would go. He knew his brother. Not the version he'd believed in, but the real version, the one the recordings and the letters had assembled. A man who planned contingencies within contingencies. A man who had prepared Roland Voss with a cover story and a property deed and a USB drive that Voss had kept as his own insurance. A man who had spent 12 years thinking 3 moves ahead. A man who would have a way out of this building that wasn't the door Dante had come through. He moved along the south wall toward the back of the warehouse, keeping low, using the equipment hulks for cover. His shoulder throbbed with each impact of his foot on the concrete. He breathed through it. He heard Lucien before he saw him. Not a footstep, but a breath, the specific quality of someone breathing carefully, managing their own sound, which is a sound in itself if you know what to listen for. He stopped. 3 seconds. Let his own breathing slow. Then he rounded the last equipment bulk and found Lucien at the rear exit door, one hand on the push bar, a weapon in the other hand pointed directly at Dante's chest. They stood 12 feet apart. "You should have brought Marco," Lucien said. His voice was even. The weapon was steady. Whatever had diminished in him out on the warehouse floor had reconsolidated here. He'd had the 30 seconds he needed to find his footing, and he'd used them well. "I didn't need Marco," Dante said. "Your shoulder's compromised. I can see it from here. It's an inconvenience." "You're bleeding," Lucien nodded toward Dante's left forearm. Dante looked. Something had cut him during the floor roll. Edge of the equipment casing, he thought. A rush-sharp corner he hadn't registered in the moment. A 3-inch gash running parallel to the forearm bone, not deep enough to be structural, but deep enough to be visible. His sleeve was dark with it. "Also an inconvenience," Dante said. Lucien looked at him for a long moment. The weapon didn't waver. Behind Dante, somewhere in the main warehouse floor, something settled. Structural sound, the building adjusting to temperature. Neither of them moved. "I'm walking out this door," Lucien said, "and you're going to let me because you have the drive and the recordings and you don't need me in custody to burn the operation down. You have everything you need. Let me go and this ends clean." "It doesn't end clean," Dante said. "That's not one of the available options." "Dante, you used Carla," Dante said. The words came out level because he made them level, because losing the level right now would cost him the next 30 seconds. And the next 30 seconds were what mattered. "You withheld a compatible donor from a dying 23-year-old girl to use as a bargaining chip to get a woman out of my life. You held my sister's survival in your hand like a card you were deciding whether to play." He paused. "That's not something I walk away from. That's not something I let go because the exit is clean." Something moved in Lucien's face. Not guilt. Dante had stopped expecting that. But something more complicated than the absence of it. An acknowledgement. The look of a man who knows that a specific thing he did was the thing that cannot be talked around, the one that exists outside the architecture of justification. "She's survived," Lucien said, "because Naomi agreed to your terms." "Yes." "So Carla's life was contingent on Naomi's compliance?" "Yes." Quieter. "Say it plainly," Dante said. "Say what you did." Lucien's jaw tightened. "I leveraged the situation. Say it plainly." A long moment. The generator hummed. Dante's forearm dripped once onto the concrete, a small, distinct sound in the quiet. "I told her Carla would die without a donor," Lucien said, "and that I had access to compatibility information the hospital didn't have yet. and that I would make sure that information reached the right people if she left. He stopped, and I would have withheld it if she'd refused. There it was. Not leveraged, not managed. He would have let Carla die. Dante breathed in, breathed out. "Put the gun down, Lucien," he said. "No, you're not going to shoot me. You don't know that." "You need me," Dante said. "You've always needed me. That's the part you never let yourself say plainly. Everything you built was built around me. The anger, the empire, the controlled grief. You needed a version of me that was too buried in the organization to ever look up and ask the right questions, and you spent 12 years maintaining that version. You can't shoot me. I'm the thing you spent 12 years making." Lucien stared at him. "And now I'm taking it back," Dante said. He moved forward, one step, two, slow, deliberate, holding Lucien's eyes. The weapon tracked him. Lucien's hand was still steady, but his breathing had changed, the careful management of it slipping slightly, the rhythm going uneven. "I'll shoot," Lucien said. "Then shoot," Dante said, and took another step. He was 6 feet away when the rear exit door blew open from the outside. Not Marco. Dante had told Marco to come through the north maintenance entry at a specific time, and the specific time was not yet. This was someone else. Someone moving fast and low with a flashlight cutting across the warehouse space, and for one fractured second, all three of them, Dante, Lucien, the figure coming through the door, were caught in the crossed light of the flashlight and the work lights and the shadow between them. The figure was Roland Voss. Voss, who had run. Voss, who had 30 minutes and a cracked burner phone and a nightstand drawer. Voss, who had apparently made a different calculation than the one Dante had expected. He was breathing hard. He'd been running. His clothes said it, the sweat at his collar, the way his chest was moving. He had nothing in his hands, no weapon, no bag, nothing. He'd come back empty-handed and breathing hard, and he stopped just inside the door and looked at the two of them and said to Lucien, in a voice that was exhausted and something past afraid, "It's over. I called the federal task force. I gave them the location and a summary of the drive contents." He paused, breathing. "I'm not going down for 12 years of your decisions. I'm not doing it." Lucien looked at Voss. Something in his face went very still. "You ran," Lucien said. "I gave you time to run." "I know. I covered you for 12 years. Every exposure, every complication, I managed—" "I know," Voss said again, "and I have 12 years of documentation of exactly how you managed it. I kept copies Dante's people didn't find." He looked at Dante now. "I want a deal. I'll testify to everything. The full structure, every transaction, every order. I'll give you Prine and the 2 federal contacts and the offshore accounts and the Velasco documentation going back to the original negotiation." He was talking fast now, the words tumbling over the breathing. "Everything. In exchange for cooperation, consideration." Silence. Then Lucien moved. He didn't go for the door. He turned the weapon toward Voss at the pivot of a man making a fast terminal calculation, and Dante crossed the remaining distance in 2 steps and hit Lucien's gun arm at the wrist with his good arm, full force, driving it upward, and the shot went into the ceiling in an explosion of noise that filled the warehouse space completely. They went down together. The concrete was unforgiving, and Dante's shoulder announced its position in the impact with a white-hot specificity that temporarily narrowed his entire world to about 6 inches. He got through it. He got through it because getting through it was the only thing on the other side of the option that wasn't getting through it. And he had spent 20 years making that calculation in various forms, and it never got easier, and it never needed to. He came up with Lucien's weapon. Lucien was on the floor, wrist at a wrong angle from the impact. Not broken, but functionally compromised for the next several minutes. He was looking up at Dante with that look again, the one that was past calculation, and for a moment he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had run out of moves inside an architecture he'd spent his entire adult life building, brought down finally by the single variable he'd never been able to fully control. The variable was that Dante had not stayed broken. "Don't," Dante said. One word. Lucien had been starting to push himself up, and he stopped. From somewhere outside, the north side of the compound, came the sound of movement. Marco's entry. On time, because Dante had given him a time and Marco did not miss times. And from beyond the outer walls, growing, the specific acoustic signature of vehicles on the waterfront road. Multiple vehicles. Moving fast. Voss, still standing by the back exit, said quietly, "That's them. I told them 40 minutes. It's been 42. Dante stood over his brother in the half-dark of the old shipyard warehouse with blood running down his forearm and his shoulder burning and the federal task force rolling up outside and the generator humming its indifferent note underneath everything. And he made a decision. He could hear Naomi somewhere behind him. She hadn't made it to the back exit before Voss came through it, and she was somewhere in the south wall shadows, close enough to have heard everything. He didn't look for her. He kept his eyes on Lucien. "Get up," he said. Lucien looked at him. "Get up," Dante said again. "You're walking out the front with me." "To hand me to the feds." "To hand you to the feds." Lucien's jaw worked. "After everything I built for this family—" "You built it for yourself," Dante said. "You built a version of this family that needed you. There's a difference." He reached down with his good arm and pulled Lucien to his feet, not gently. "And I'm going to spend the next however long making sure everyone understands the difference, starting tonight." Lucien stood. His wrist was cradled against his body. His face had settled into something that was not quite acceptance and not quite defiance. Somewhere between them, in the territory that belongs to men who have been genuinely and finally caught. "You're going to burn everything," Lucien Maschen said. "Everything Papa built." "Papa built it on what you told him was necessary," Dante said. "I heard the recording, I know what he knew and when he knew it and what he decided to do with it." He held Lucien's eyes. "I'm not burning what Papa built. I'm burning what you made of it." He turned Lucien toward the main warehouse floor and walked him forward, through the work lights and the settled dust, and past the two men on the floor, past the equipment hulks and the rusted containers of the first Moretti fortune, toward the front of the compound where Marco was coming through the north entry, and the federal vehicles were stopping outside, and the whole long architecture of the last 12 years was finally, irrevocably, running out of time. Behind him, Naomi emerged from the south wall shadow and fell into step without being asked, because she had always understood instinctively when a moment required presence rather than distance, and this was that moment, the walk through the old shipyard toward the lights outside where everything was about to become official and irreversible and real, Lucien ahead of them both, the compound walls opening up around them to the waterfront night air, cold and salt sharp, and cold and salt sharp, and cutting in a way that felt, against Dante's bleeding forearm and wrecked shoulder, almost clarifying. The federal vehicles had stopped in a semicircle outside the main gate. 6 of them, headlights on, agents fanning out in the practiced geometry of a coordinated operation. Someone with a bullhorn was issuing instructions into the compound that echoed off the metal walls and came back distorted. Dante walked Lucien through the gate with his hand on his brother's arm and stopped in the headlight wash where the agents could see his hands clearly. Marco appeared at his left flank, took in the blood and the shoulder in one rapid assessment, and had the discipline to deal with it later. An agent in a blue jacket broke from the formation and approached, senior, from his positioning, the way the others tracked him. "Dante Moretti," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Dante said. "This is Lucien Moretti. He'll be cooperative." He looked at Lucien when he said it. Lucien said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "You're bleeding," the agent said. "I'm aware." "We'll need you to be—" "I have an encrypted drive," Dante said, "containing 12 years of internal communications, financial transfers, and operational records connecting Lucien Moretti and a current Moretti legal officer named Curtis Prine to federal obstruction, money laundering, and witness interference." He produced the drive from his jacket pocket with 2 fingers and held it out. "I also have 2 audio recordings from a private archive that establish the origin timeline. And you have Roland Voss, who came through the back exit approximately 4 minutes ago and who has agreed to provide full testimonial cooperation." The agent looked at the drive, looked at Dante, took the drive. 2 other agents stepped forward and took Lucien by the arms. Lucien went without resistance. At the edge of the headlight wash, he stopped and turned back once, not to the agents, not to the compound, to Dante. He didn't say anything, neither did Dante. 12 years of manufactured grief and calculated architecture sat between them in the cold waterfront air, and neither of them had words that were adequate to it, so they let it be what it was. Then Lucien turned away, and the agents walked him to a vehicle, and the door closed. And that was the last time Dante looked directly at his brother for a very long time. Naomi was standing slightly behind him and to the left. He turned. She was watching the vehicles, her arms crossed over her chest against the cold, her face doing the complicated thing it did when she was processing something she hadn't finished processing yet. He took off his jacket, his good arm first, then carefully working the damaged shoulder through, and put it around her without asking. She looked at him. "Your arm," she said. "I know." "I know," he said again. "In a minute." She pulled the jacket tighter, and they stood in the headlight wash of the federal operation dismantling 12 years of his brother's architecture. And the cold came off the water, and the generator inside the compound finally sputtered and went quiet. And for the first time in longer than Dante could accurately measure, the noise inside his own head went quiet with it. The hospital was a formality. Dante knew it was a formality and submitted to it anyway because Marco drove him there directly from the shipyard with the particular expression of a man who had decided that certain arguments were non-negotiable, and because Naomi sat in the back seat beside him without speaking, and her silence had a quality to it that communicated, clearly and without words, that she agreed with Marco on this one. The gash on his forearm required 11 stitches. The shoulder was not dislocated but had sustained what the attending physician called a significant soft tissue injury with characteristic understatement, and they wrapped it and gave him a sling he put on in the hospital and removed in the parking lot. He kept the stitches. Those were structural. Naomi sat in the waiting area while they worked on him. When he came out, she looked at the sling's absence and the stitches' presence and made a specific face that he filed away without commenting on. They drove back to Manhattan in the early morning dark, the city still mostly asleep, the streets holding that particular quality of emptiness that belongs only to the hours between 2 and 5, when even New York momentarily runs out of things to insist upon. Marco dropped them at Dante's building. Neither of them had discussed this. It was simply where the car went, and neither of them redirected it. In the elevator, Naomi leaned against the back wall with her arms still crossed inside his jacket and her eyes straight ahead. She looked exhausted in a way that went past the physical. The specific depletion of someone who has been carrying a specific weight for a specific number of years and has just watched that weight become, if not lighter, then at least differently distributed. "Prine," she said. The elevator moved. "Marco's team will have him before 7, Dante said. "He doesn't know Voss made contact yet. He's home, probably sleeping." "And Voss's deal?" "That's for the federal prosecutors to structure. He'll get something. What he gave them is substantial." She nodded, looked at the elevator doors. "What happens to the organization?" she said. Not a question exactly. More like a thing she was saying aloud to make it real. "It gets taken apart," Dante said. "The legitimate holdings are real. The development companies, the shipping contracts that aren't connected to the criminal structure, the financial services arm, those survive because they're actually legitimate. The rest," he stopped, considered. "The rest has been running on the infrastructure Lucian built around my anger for 12 years. Without that infrastructure, it doesn't hold, and I'm not going to hold it." She turned her head and looked at him. "You built it," she said. "I built what he designed the conditions for," Dante said. "That's different. I told him that tonight, and I meant it." The elevator stopped. The doors opened. "I spent 12 years becoming something specific because I believed a specific thing was true. The thing wasn't true, which means the becoming was..." He stepped out into the hallway and stopped, looking for the word. "Misdirected." She stepped out beside him. They walked to the apartment door. He unlocked it with his good hand, which took longer than it should have. Inside, she went to the kitchen window and looked out at the city going gray at the edges with early morning. He got water from the tap and drank it standing at the counter and watched her look at the skyline the way people look at things when they're not really looking at them. "I have a question," he said. She turned. "The visits to my mother," he said. 11 times, 7 months. He set the glass down. What did you talk about? Something moved across Naomi's face. Not pain exactly, but the landscape just adjacent to it. Everything, she said. She talked about you mostly. About Carla. About your father when he was young, before everything calcified. She talked about a house she grew up in Palermo that had a fig tree in the back garden. She paused. Near the end, she talked less. I would just sit there. Sometimes I read to her. She liked that. Dante looked at the counter. She knew who I was, Naomi said quietly. By the fourth visit. I didn't tell her. She just looked at me one day and said your name like a question, and I didn't deny it. She didn't tell anyone. She stopped. She held my hand at the end of the next visit and said, "Thank you for coming back." That was all. His mother had known. His mother had looked at the young woman sitting in the chair by her bed and had understood who she was and had chosen silence, chosen to hold her hand and say thank you for coming back, carrying the knowledge alone the way she had carried so many things alone, and had taken it with her when she left. He pressed the heel of his good hand against the counter and breathed. She would have liked you, he said. His voice was steady. He made sure of that. I liked her, Naomi said. They were quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the sky was beginning its slow, categorical shift from black to the particular deep blue that precedes dawn. Not light yet, but the memory of light. The suggestion that light was a thing that had existed and would exist again. I need to sleep, Naomi said. The guest room, I know where it is, she said. She'd been here before, 12 years ago, twice, when this had been his father's apartment and they'd come for dinner. She walked past him toward the hallway and stopped at the kitchen doorway. Dante, she said. He looked at her. What you said to Lucien, that you were taking it back. She held his eyes. What does that mean? What are you actually taking back? He thought about this. Really thought about it. Not the quick operational answer, but the real one, the one that lived under the 12 years of architecture. Myself, he said. I'm taking back myself. She looked at him for a long moment with that lateral quality of attention that had always made him feel seen in a way that was sometimes uncomfortable and always real. Then she nodded, once, and went down the hallway. He stayed in the kitchen until the sky outside completed its shift to blue. The next 3 months were the most expensive of his life, and not in money. The federal investigation expanded outward from Voss's testimony and the drive contents with the momentum of something that had been waiting a long time to move. Curtis Prine was arrested at his apartment on a Tuesday morning and spent 48 hours maintaining silence before his own attorney advised him that the documentation against him was comprehensive enough to make silence a mathematical losing position. He cooperated. The 2 federal contacts Lucien had been managing for 6 years were quietly removed from their positions and processed through a separate channel designed to minimize institutional embarrassment, which was the government's word for it. Lucien's arraignment was on a Wednesday. Dante did not attend. He watched the coverage from his office with the sound off, which felt like the right amount of engagement. The legitimate business restructuring took longer than the legal proceedings and required more of him in the specific way that constructive work always requires more than destructive work. Destruction has momentum. It moves on its own once started, but building something different from the rubble of what existed before requires constant, deliberate attention to the distinction between what can be saved and what only looks like it can be saved. He spent the first month in rooms with attorneys and accountants and structural consultants, mapping what was real. The development companies were real. 3 of the shipping contracts were clean enough to retain with new oversight structures. The financial services operation required significant surgery but had a viable core. Everything else, the network of arrangements and relationships and leveraged obligations that had constituted the actual Moretti criminal operation, he handed over systematically to the federal task force through a cooperation agreement that his attorneys negotiated with the precision of people being paid to be precise. He was not granted immunity. He hadn't asked for it. He'd asked for a structured accountability process, which was a different thing, and what he received in exchange for the completeness of his cooperation was a sentencing consideration that his attorneys characterized as favorable and that Dante characterized as what it was, a consequence he was prepared to accept for things he had actually done. He would serve time. Not immediately, the The legal process had its own timeline. But eventually, he told Marco on the drive home from one of the first attorney meetings, and Marco had been quiet for a long time, and then had said, "I'll be here when you're out," which was Marco's version of an entire speech. He told Carla in her kitchen on a Saturday morning while her kids were in the backyard and her husband was at the grocery store and the house smelled like coffee and the particular warmth of people who have built something worth coming home to. She listened to the full version, everything, the recordings, the letters, the shipyard, the deal, without interrupting, which cost her something visible. When he finished, she sat for a while. "Lucien would have let me die," she said. "Yes." She looked at her coffee mug. Her hands were flat on the table, the same gesture she'd used when she covered his hand with her, but reversed now, grounding herself. "And Naomi, she gave part of her liver to save your life," Dante said. "While I was—" He stopped. "While I thought she'd chosen to leave." Carla looked at him for a long time, with the eyes of someone recalculating the past 12 years of her own life in real time. Every moment of recovery, the slow return of health, the fig tree her mother had talked about in her final months, all of it threading back to a single decision made by a young woman who had been given an impossible choice and had made it alone and silently and had never asked for acknowledgement. "I want to see her," Carla said. "I'll ask her," Dante said. "Don't ask her," Carla said. "Tell her I want to see her. There's a difference." He almost smiled. Didn't quite make it, but close. The meeting between Carla and Naomi happened on a Tuesday evening at a restaurant in Park Slope that Carla chose because it was near her house and she'd wanted Naomi on her territory, which Dante recognized as his sister's version of establishing the terms of an important conversation. He did not attend. He dropped Naomi off outside and drove around the neighborhood for 2 hours and 20 minutes and then parked half a block away and waited. When Naomi came out, she stood on the sidewalk for a moment before she saw his car. She walked to it and got in and sat there. "Well?" he said. She looked straight ahead. Her eyes were slightly red at the edges, which she was managing with the composure he'd come to understand was not coldness, but its opposite. The discipline of someone who feels things at a volume that would be unmanageable without structure. She wanted to know everything, Naomi said. The letters, the timeline, what the hospital was like. A pause. She asked me if it hurt. "What did you say?" I said yes. She looked at her hands in her lap. She said she was sorry. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. She said she wasn't apologizing. She was just sorry it had happened that way to me. There's a difference. She paused. She sounds like you. She's smarter than me. She said the same thing about herself. Naomi looked at him. She wants me to come to dinner with the kids on a Sunday. He kept his eyes on the street. "Do you want to go?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "It's a lot to take in, being part of something like that, after being outside of it for so long." "You were never outside of it," he said. "That's what I've been understanding. You were the center of it the whole time. You just weren't in the room." She was quiet. "I have something to tell you," he said, "about the legal situation." He told her. The cooperation agreement, the sentencing consideration, the timeline. He told it straight because there was no version of telling it that benefited from being softened. She listened without moving. When he finished, she said, "How long?" "The attorneys think 18 months. Could be less with the cooperation credit." "Could it be more?" "It could be more," he said. "Yes." She absorbed this. He watched her absorb it, the way she held it, turned it, placed it in relation to everything else, and looked at the shape it made. "Okay," she said. "That's all?" "What do you want me to say?" She turned to look at him fully, directly. "That it's unfair? It probably is, relative to what Lucien will face, that I wish it were different, obviously." She held his eyes. "But you made choices, Dante. You made them with full information about what they were. The consequences of those choices being real doesn't change the fact that you're also the person who walked Lucien out of that warehouse instead of leaving him on the floor." She paused. "I can hold both of those things at the same time. I've been holding contradictory things about you for 12 years. I'm practiced. He looked at the street. A couple walked past on the sidewalk, close together, the woman laughing at something. Normal life moving past at its usual pace, indifferent to everything that had happened in the past 3 months. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need you to understand that whatever you answer, I'll accept it. There's no architecture around this question, no leverage, no conditions. She waited. When I come out, he said, I'd like to try. He kept his eyes on the street because looking at her directly, for this felt like too much pressure on the thing itself, like touching something too soon after it's been put back together. Not because of the 12 years, not as restitution for anything, not as the end of a story, just, I would like to try. You and me. The version of that we never got to find out. Silence. A long one. He was prepared for the silence to end in a direction he didn't want. He had decided before he asked that he could handle that, and he believed himself. I need time, she said. Not as an answer. Time isn't a no, but I've spent 12 years making decisions in response to things that were done to me. I want the next decision to be mine. Entirely mine. Made from stillness, not from momentum. That's fair, he said. Don't say it's fair, she said. Don't manage it. I'm not asking for your approval of my process. He almost smiled again. Made it this time, briefly. Okay. Okay, she said. She got out of the car, walked to the curb, and then stopped and turned back, one hand on the open door. The park slope street was quiet behind her, leaves starting to come down from the trees that lined the block, the air with that October quality of something ending gracefully rather than stopping. Dante, she said. He looked at her. The coastal town, she said. In Maine. The deposit you put down 12 years ago. She held his eyes. Is the place still there? He hadn't thought about it in years. The deposit had eventually converted to some kind of holding arrangement he'd never formally closed, handled by a trust administrator who had never been given instructions to dissolve it. I think so, he said. She nodded slowly. Then it'll keep, she said. A little longer. She closed the car door. He watched her walk up the sidewalk toward the subway entrance, her hands in the pockets of her coat, her stride even and unhurried, the jacket she'd borrowed from him that night at the shipyard still on her back because neither of them had thought to return it and neither of them had raised it, and at some point in the past 3 months, it had simply become hers. She went down the subway stairs without looking back. He sat in the car for a while after she was gone. The couple who'd passed earlier were coming back the other direction now, still close together, the woman's laughter gone quiet. The trees dropped leaves in the still air. Somewhere down the block a door opened, and the smell of someone's dinner drifted out, and then the door closed and took it back. He started the car. 6 months later, in the week before he was scheduled to report to the minimum security facility outside Trenton where he would serve 14 months of a restructured sentence, Dante drove up the coast alone. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. Marco knew, because Marco always knew, and had said nothing, which was the right call. Carla had sent him a text that morning that said only, "Come back in one piece. The kids are asking about you." He'd sent back a single word, and she'd responded with a photograph of his nephew attempting to eat a piece of fruit that was too large for his face, which was Carla's version of saying everything was going to be fine. The coastal town in Maine was exactly as he'd held it in memory. Smaller than he'd imagined it when they'd planned it at 29. Quieter. The off-season having stripped the tourist layer away and left the actual place underneath. The water was gray and serious in November. The houses along the cliff road were mostly dark or minimally lit, their occupants settled in for the long winter interior. The property was still there. A small house on a promontory above the water, maintained by a local management company under the trust arrangement, unoccupied for years. He had the key from the trust administrator, a physical key on a plain ring, the specific ordinariness of which he'd found unexpectedly moving when it arrived in the mail 3 weeks ago. He sat on the back porch in a coat that was not warm enough for November on the Maine coast and looked at the water for a long time. The wind came off the water and found every gap in the coat with professional thoroughness. He let it. The cold was clarifying in the way that Naomi's voice was clarifying. It told you exactly where you were and didn't decorate the information. He thought about his father saying the girl was innocent and accepting it's not relevant as an answer. He thought about whether he would have done the same, whether the version of himself that existed before all of this would have made the same choice his father made. Acknowledge the wrong, accept the explanation, let it rest. He didn't know. He hoped not. He understood sitting here in the wind that not knowing was probably the right answer, because certainty about what you would have done in a past you never lived was the kind of story people told themselves to avoid. The harder question of what they were doing right now. What he was doing right now was sitting on a porch above the water, stitches long dissolved, shoulder mostly functional, 12 years of a manufactured life being methodically converted into something he could actually account for. What he was doing right now was preparing to walk into a legal consequence with his eyes open and his hands clean of the things he was being held for and not clean of other things, which was the truth of it, and the truth of it was what he had. He heard a car on the cliff road above, didn't turn around, footsteps on the porch stairs, one set, unhurried. Naomi sat down in the other chair, the one that had been there when he arrived, matching his, facing the water, positioned by whoever had furnished this place as if they'd known, and pulled her coat tighter and looked at the gray water and the gray sky and the thin line where they met. He looked at her. She looked at the water. "You didn't tell me you were coming," he said. "No." "How did you know?" "Marco," she said. "He called me." Don't be angry with him. He wasn't angry with Marco. He was going to have an extremely pointed conversation with Marco at a future date, but he was not angry. "Carla too," Naomi said. "She said if I didn't go, she was going to drive up herself, with the kids." "That sounds like her?" "It does." A pause. "She's been calling me. Every week. Just to talk. She's very persistent. She learned it from our mother." Naomi was quiet for a moment. The wind came off the water and moved her hair, and she tucked it back with one hand, the gesture so familiar it landed somewhere in him with a weight that was not painful exactly, but was not weightless either. "I thought about what you said," she said, "in the car, in Park Slope." He waited. "I've been thinking about it since," she said. "I thought about it when I was clearing out my apartment in Crown Heights. I thought about it when I was helping organize Hartwell's funding restructuring, because the Moretti Foundation's first charitable grant went to Hartwell, which your attorney apparently arranged, and which I had feelings about." "I know," he said. "I was told." "I imagine you were." She looked at the water. "I thought about it on the subway and in the grocery store and in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep, which was often. I thought about what it meant to choose something from stillness instead of from momentum." She paused. "And I realized I'd been still for 12 years. I'd been so careful about not letting anything move me that I'd confused stillness with safety. They're not the same thing." The water moved below them. A gull crossed the gray sky and disappeared. "I'm not waiting for you to come back to decide," she said. "I've decided." She turned and looked at him directly, the full quality of her attention, nothing managed, nothing held at distance. "I'm telling you now so that when you go in next week, you have something actual to hold on to. Not a maybe, not a door left open, something actual." He looked at her. The wind, the gray water, her face in the November coastal light, older than the face he'd memorized at 29, and more than that face in every way that mattered. "Naomi," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's my answer. Yes. To the trying." She looked back at the water. "I wanted to say it here. Where we were going to start, it seemed right." He didn't say anything for a while. Neither did she. They sat on the porch above the Maine coast in November with the wind working at their coats and the water doing what water does. Indifferent, enormous, continuous. And the silence between them was not the managed silence of two people holding things back, but the other kind. The kind that only exists between people who have already said the hardest things and are resting in what remains. After a while, he reached over and put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. She turned her hand over and held it. The water moved. The light shifted. The gray above them made its slow, unhurried adjustment toward whatever came next. They stayed until the cold made staying impractical, and then they went inside, and they closed the door on the water in the wind, in the long specific wait of 12 years. And what existed on the other side of that closed door was not an ending. It was, at last, a beginning that belonged entirely to them.